So I wanted to do this video, do a reaction to Glenn Greenwald. He released this video the other day. I've been pretty busy, left some equipment at the house. Plus it's my birthday, so I've just been kind of all over the place. So definitely get into it now. It is of AOC and everything that kind of transpired within the Democratic Party after the whole January 6th incident. Um, Glenn Greenwald is a great journalist. Anybody who's been in left independent media, you probably know who he is. He's probably been on your show. They probably did some reporting up from him. Um, Very just straight to the point. Um, Journalist calls a spade a spade. Balls and stripes. Obviously, he's kind of been more into getting on some right wing shows like Tucker Carlson, um, Megan Kelly. So I do generally listen to Glenn Greenwald when it comes to reporting. Um, Definitely isn't accepted by CNN and MSNBC. But I want to kind of preface this by saying I really thought highly of AOC in 2018. Obviously, she's attractive. She's younger. Um, she's Puerto Rican. She speaks Spanish. She kind of had this working class background as a bartender. Of course, the right wingers are gonna get on me. Da, 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 she was just a bartender. So is Lowen Bobert. Um, but that kind of has changed. Just kind of looking from a critical political um, sphere. I don't think, as of currently, she has what it would take to run for president. I know they're kind of pushing her. I know they're kind of name dropping her for the 2028. Um, I really don't see it. Um, Things can obviously change between now and then, but so I think the main problem is she doesn't have a backbone when it comes to the Democratic establishment. Of course, she came in, protesting outside of Nancy Pelosi's office, um, was challenging Democrats, supporting challengers into Democratic primaries against Democratic incumbents, which I did support. I thought she was going to kind of stay on the whole Bernie Sanders economic populism, but obviously she's kind of gotten more into the woke, um, hyper wokeness, which is it's not really appealing to a large majority of the Democratic Party, large majority of independents, and large majority of those who are apolitical, and a large majority of those who may be dissenting on the Republican Party who would be willing to vote for you as president. We do see that Barack Obama was able to do this. He was able to get this huge coalition of young people, independents, dissenters to support him. Donald Trump, obviously, in the 2024 election, was able to do the same thing. He was able to garner a lot of support and build this big coalition of voters. I don't think she necessarily has that talent, that ability to really convey to normies. Um, So first thing is obviously she doesn't have the statistical fortitude. Not saying she's trans or anything. She just doesn't have the balls needed to really go against her party, which you may need to kind of beat Congress into submission to be able to help to kind of force your hand to for them to get the policies that you need to get done, especially in the first 100 days. Um, that's one. Number two, she doesn't have that ability to relate to normies, um, especially those in the South, the Midwest, that she's really going to have to be able to garner that kind of support, especially to win the Electoral College. Um, you're not going to be able to really relate to Latino men. You're not going to really be able to relate to working class Black men, the working class, um, and suburban whites. I think is she would be able to run for Senate in New York. I think that she's well liked in New York. So I think she better take somebody like Chuck Schumer's position. But you're talking about president, you got to look at the whole country. So I don't think she has that ability to even talk to and relate to blue collar working class folks. Um, and another big thing that is her downfall is as somebody who is also college educated, um, and I understand how people in education and higher ed think, how they talk to one another, how the kind of vernacular that they use. Um, that's great if you're on a college campus. That's great if you're around intellectuals and philosophers and stuff like that. But when you're talking to the everyday normie, um, you can't do it. I myself, I grew up around normies my whole life. I still work with normies. I kind of have quote unquote left Hollywood now that I'm back into my upbringing with blue collar construction, truck driving, stuff like that. A lot of my friends are also blue collar, um, so I understand that it's great that you have this vocabulary, this vernacular, but a lot of people don't want to play detective and um, de- to decipher what you're saying when you could have just said it in a more normal way. Um, so I think that's one of her big downfalls as well. Barack Obama is obviously able to convey that, even though he kind of is the elite. Donald Trump is also able to, talk in such a way that's, widely accepted, even though he's elite. Um, so that's just kind of looking at it from that lens. But I really wanted to get into this. Um, this is Glenn Greenwald, as I had said. Definitely um, want to take a look at this. All right.
Let's just remember some of the things that have been said about this issue. Hear from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in October of 2021. She said, quote, any member of Congress who helped plot a terrorist attack on our nation's capital must be expelled. This was a terror attack, 138 injured, almost 10 dead. Those responsible remain a danger to our democracy, our country, and our human life in the vicinity of our capital and beyond. I love that sentence. Those responsible remain a danger to our democracy, our country, and human life in the vicinity of our capital and beyond. Now, everybody was very confused. Like, what do you mean almost 10 people died on January 6th? First of all, why would you use that formulation? Why not say the number of people who died? Why would you say almost 10? What does that mean? Like 6, 8, 9, 7? What does that mean? But as I said, there were only 4 people who died on January 6th. She's apparently counting some of the protesters who died. She says 5 protesters died on January 6th. Or I believe she said 4 or 5. She's counting police officers, including, as you might recall, Brian Sicknick, who we were told had his head bashed in by a fire extinguisher and died at the Capitol. And in fact, it turned out he died of natural causes, as the autopsy said. She's counting police officers who committed suicide days or weeks after January 6th. It would, of course, be embarrassing if you tried to call it a coup or an insurrection and the only people who died on January 6th, which was true, were the people who were actually there protesting for Donald Trump, one of whom was shot, 2 of whom died of a heart attack, and 1 of whom died of a drug overdose. These were not people who were part of a well-trained militia, to put that mildly. But there was a need to exaggerate it intensely from the beginning, and so it couldn't just be that 4 Trump supporters died. You had to have other people dying as well, and so they just lied about it constantly. Here, just to give you a reminder of how these lies proliferated from the very beginning about January 6th, all with the intention, while these emotions were still raw, to make it seem as though there was some kind of mass murder spree on the part of Trump supporters at the Capitol. Listen to what the people who insist they're the only ones who combat disinformation ended up saying.
Qualified it. Officer Brian Sicknick died after being hit in the head with a fire extinguisher during the hours-long attack.
They beat a Capitol police officer to death with a fire extinguisher.
Officer Brian Sicknick died after being hit in the head with a fire extinguisher during the fight.
He died at the age of 42 after he was bludgeoned with a fire extinguisher.
All with such a melodramatic tone. He was beaten. Just think about this. They went on television and they said that Brian Sicknick was murdered by Capitol Hill protesters because he was beaten to death. His head was bludgeoned by a fire extinguisher by protesters. A complete and utter fabrication. And you just see one network after the next, as usual, saying it in unison. Here from NBC News, 3 months later, 3.5 months later, reported the truth because they had to, because the medical examiner pronounced it. Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick died of natural causes after the riot. A medical examiner says an autopsy revealed that Sicknick, who died hours after the Capitol riot, suffered 2 strokes at the base of the brain stem caused by a blood clot. And then here from Newsweek in August, quote, 4 Capitol Hill police officers have died by suicide since the January 6th insurrection, and they decided they're going to count 4 suicides by police officers for who knows what reason. I mean, is it really reasonable if a police officer kills themselves to blame their participation in a 3-hour riot? If that's not something they can withstand, what are they doing as police officers? And could you imagine any other instance where that framework would be used? If a Black Lives Matter protest happened and it turned into a riot and it was violent, which often happened, and there ended up being clashes between the protesters and the police officers, which happened, and then a month later or a month and a half later, a police officer involved in that killed themselves, would anybody say, oh, this was a violent victim of the Black Lives Matter mob who murdered this police officer because they killed themselves after being involved in a clash? Of course not. This is a deliberate attempt to take this 3-hour riot, wildly exaggerate it with the dual purposes of trying to demonize Donald Trump and his movement, obviously, but also to justify domestic crackdowns by the U.S. security state. That's what they always do. That's what they did after 9/11. It's what they've done in countless instances where they claim there's a domestic threat. That's the playbook, and that was a major part of why this was exaggerated. I don't mean to keep citing AOC, but she was really at the top of her game when it came to drama queen hysteria, even though she was nowhere near the actual riot. She wasn't even in the building. Here she is on CNN in a very contemplative way, really feeling like she got a second lease on life, just escaping by the most incredible amount of luck. Some spirit must have really been protecting her. It was a miracle that she made it out alive. And here she is talking about what became very close to happening, according to her, on January 6th.
I didn't think that I was just going to be killed. I thought other things were going to happen to me as well.
So what sounds like what you're telling me right now is that you didn't only think that you were going to die, you thought you were going to be raped.
Yeah. I thought I was.
And that you now understand, having thought about it, is because of your experience.
Yeah, I think so.
Look at that expression by Dana Bash there at the end. She's like, this is really serious. This is very grave. AOC not only thought she was going to die, she thought she was going to be raped, even though she was nowhere near anything that was happening. That all was in her mind. And then you might remember, hours after the riot was subdued, she went on to Twitter and she put her notorious tweet that said, quote, I'm okay. And then about 3 weeks later, there was a controversy because there were various stocks that were skyrocketing that Reddit speculators had purposely caused to skyrocket in order to impose a lot of financial pain on short sellers who had bet on the collapse of those stocks, and instead they sent those stocks like GameStore and others to a very
He meant GameStop, GameStore.
very high level. And because it was harming very rich people, some of the apps that people were using to trade froze the selling and buying of that stock in order to protect those short sellers. And Ted Cruz said,
And I unequivocally want to say, fuck Robin Hood. Y'all are fucking trash. Since that fucking day, I left. I know thousands of other people also left. Fuck you. You shut down the whole system, shut down the whole app just to protect Citadel, and that's some fuck nigga shit.
AOC came out and said, this seems very improper. We should investigate. And Ted Cruz said, you know what? I agree with AOC here. We should join together and investigate it. And she responded by saying, sorry, but you tried to have me murdered 3 weeks ago. I'll work with Republicans, but not ones who have tried to have me killed. This was the insanity. It was as bad as Russiagate, if not worse. Everything that was being said about it. But the issue is that it was really hard to try and discern whether or not these people actually believed what they were saying, despite how facially preposterous it was, or if they were saying it for effect, for a purpose, in order to manipulate the public, to be and put into a state of fear-mongering. Usually it's a very complex mix of those two ignoble motives. But in this case, it's no longer a question. It's so incredibly clear that none of them meant anything that they were saying, because if they did, they wouldn't be unanimous in standing by and allowing Adolf Hitler to return to power. And yet that's exactly what they're doing. They were urged today by Joe Biden in his op-ed, in the op-ed written by who knows who, the same people who have been running the government in his name, that was published yesterday. Quote, Joe Biden, what Americans should remember about January 6th. Quote, 4 years ago, our democracy was put to the test and we prevailed. Quote, on this January 6th, order will be called. Clerks, staff, and members of Congress will gather to certify the results of a free and fair presidential election and ensure a peaceful transfer of power. Capitol Police will stand guard over the citadel of our democracy. The citadel of our democracy. The Vice President of the United States, faithful to her duty under our Constitution, will preside over the certification of our opponent's victory in the November election. For much of our history, this proceeding was treated as pro forma, a routine act, but after what we all witnessed on January 6, 2021, we know we can never again take it for granted. Violent insurrectionists attacked the Capitol, threatened the lives of elected officials, and assaulted brave law enforcement officers. We should be proud that our democracy withstood this attack, and we should be glad we will not see such a shameful attack again this year. But we should not forget. We must remember the wisdom of the adage that any nation that forgets its past is doomed to repeat it. We cannot accept a repeat of what occurred 4 years ago. An unrelenting effort has been underway to rewrite, even erase the history of that day, to tell us we didn't see what we all saw with our own eyes, to dismiss concerns about it as some kind of partisan obsession, to explain it away as a protest that just got out of hand. That's exactly what it was, a protest that just got out of hand. In time, there will be Americans who didn't witness the January 6th riot firsthand, but will learn about it from footage and testimony of that day, from what is written in the history books, and from the truth we pass on to our children. We cannot allow the truth be lost. Allow the truth to be lost. Thousands of rioters crossed the National Mall and climbed the Capitol walls, smashing windows and kicking down doors just blocks away. A bomb was found near the location of the incoming vice president, threatening her life. Law enforcement officials were beaten, dragged, knocked unconscious, and stomped upon. Some police officers ultimately died as a result. None of that is true. I could basically dissect it sentence for sentence.
So to kind of give a little bit of a side note, so big fan of Vin Diesel, big fan of Ice Cube. Um, Obviously they did Triple X, and then Ice Cube did, well, Vin Diesel did Triple X, and then Ice Cube did Triple X State of the Union. So obviously it came out um 2003 to 2005. Can't remember exactly offhand. So I'm probably like 12 to 15 years old. And William Dafoe, the villain in it, said, "Tree of Liberty must be watered from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." So as a kid, I'm like, bro, that shit hard. That shit is tough. So, now that I'm older, I understand where it came from. So, let me go back. But obviously this kind of transpired after an insurrection that took place shortly after the inception of the country, about 10, 11 years later. Um, they were having problems with the Articles of Confederation, which kind of eventually ushered in the Constitution. But Thomas Jefferson wrote, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Obviously, July 4th, 1776. So, this happened about 11 years later. Jefferson was referring to the need to occasionally challenge tyrants who try to violate people's rights. Jefferson also believed that a small amount of rebellion was beneficial and necessary in politics. He wrote, "What a country can preserve its liberty if all the rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance, let them take arms." So obviously, we're not going to go into some of the questionable stuff Thomas Jefferson supported and did. We're just going to look at him purely for his literary works and for his resistance. That's kind of how I objectively look at Jefferson. Obviously, we're not going to go into Monticello, his slave plantation today. But there was, hold on one second. Uh, yeah. Yeah, where does this anarchy exist? Where did it ever exist except in the single instance of Massachusetts? And can history produce an instance of a rebellion so honorably conducted? I say nothing of its motives. They were founded in ignorance, not wickedness. God forbid we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion. The people cannot be all and always well informed. The part which is wrong will be discontented in proportion to the importance of the facts they misconceive. If they remain quiet under such misconceptions, it is a lethargy, the forerunner of death to the public liberty. We have had 13 states independent, 11 years. There has been one rebellion. That comes to one rebellion in a century and a half for each state. What country before ever existed a century and a half without a rebellion? And what country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? Let them take arms. The remedy is to set them right as to facts, pardon, and pacify them. What signify a few lives lost in a century or two? The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is natural manure. Our convention has been too much impressed by the insurrection of Massachusetts, and in the spur of the moment, they are setting up a kite to keep the hen yard in order. I hope in God this article will be rectified before the new Constitution is accepted. So obviously, Jan 6 is it was just a riot that just went overboard. I'm not sitting here saying it was good or bad. It was just, in my personal opinion, it wasn't an insurrection. But even if it was an insurrection, then according to one of the founding fathers, the writer of the Declaration of Independence, it is seemed to be acceptable. So to sit here and say it's undemocratic for something like that is, off.
But you see the rhetorical effort to depict it as belonging in the pantheon of major moral evils in the United States, similar to what Sonny Huston did. Whoever wrote the article for Biden had enough sense to be sufficiently subtle not to explicitly compare it to the Holocaust and slavery, but that's the...
Which is fucking crazy. To compare it to the Holocaust and slavery is just disingenuous. But I mean, what would Sonny really know? It's not like, you know, she's not a paid propagandist. A cute, milfy paid propagandist, but still a paid propagandist. You send me a check like that, I'm just gonna cash it and still tell the truth. But y'all are more welcome to send me a check.
ethos of the language being invoked. This is something that is going to be in our history books. We can't allow revisionism. People who didn't live through this heinous event are going to have to learn about it. But again, if Joe Biden or anybody writing on his behalf actually believes any of this, why aren't they taking the action commensurate with that belief? Probably remember about a month ago, Joe Biden invited the insurrectionist Nazi to the White House and shook his hand and said, whatever you need, we will be happy to give you. None of this is the behavior of people who believe in any of the things that they're saying. From the New York Times today, January 6th, that solemn day that will go down in American history forever. Congress certifies Trump's victory in ritual disrupted by violence in 2021. Quote, Vice President Kamala Harris announced Donald J. Trump's win in a quick session without drama, a stark contrast from 4 years ago. Why? If the Trump supporters were willing to protest on the streets because they thought they had the election stolen, why wouldn't Democrats be doing more to disrupt the natural order of business if they think that a Nazi, white supremacist fascist is returning to power? Obviously, the New York Times needed to do a retrospective to remind everybody of it. The New York Times today, the January 6 rioters 4 years later. And then here from NBC News, Congress certifies Trump's 2024 election win 4 years after he inspired a riot. You see the attempt, not just to report on what happened, but the constant attempt to massage and manipulate the headline. CNN, this was, it says, yeah, it's today. 4 years after his supporters invaded the U.S. Capitol, Trump is more powerful than ever. You know, it's really, the thing that amazes me, and I actually was on Megyn Kelly's show earlier today, for those of you who haven't seen that or want to watch it, and we touched on this a little bit. The strategy of the Democratic Party and its allies in media and the establishment wing of the Republican Party that was devoted to Donald Trump's defeat was very clear. It was to say, don't care about policy or ideology or any of the dissatisfactions that you have in your life. There's something bigger at stake. It's January 6th and our democracy and this person who wants to dismantle it. And that was what the whole tactic was about, with joining with Liz Cheney and parading her around and talking about the Republicans that were supporting Kamala Harris, which was to say, even these conservatives don't agree with us on anything. And that, by the way, was a falsehood as well. Even Liz Cheney said the reason we're supporting Kamala Harris isn't just because of January 6th, but because we agree more with her foreign policy than we do with the Trump-led GOP. But the idea was to...
Kamala getting endorsed by Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney was such a great idea. It was such a presidential winning strategy. I'm glad that she used it. I mean, who doesn't love a good neocon and forever wars and lying about going to war? I think that's just, and just killing a whole bunch of innocent people and making sure that soldiers die. That's just, yeah. Oh yeah, it was great strategy.
Depict this as being everybody's coming together of decency who believes in our country despite policy differences, because there's something much bigger at stake, a question of decency and whether democracy will prevail. And that tactic turned out to be a towering, abject failure. No one voted on that. No one cared. Nobody thought that Donald Trump was some grave existential threat to American democracy who wasn't already going to vote against him anyway. That's not the thing that Americans are waking up and worrying about. They've repeatedly said what they're worrying about in poll after poll after poll, and it's not that. And yet Democrats and the media, their media allies, had nothing else. They had clung to this narrative for so long. Just like in 2016, they clung to the narrative of Russiagate that nobody cared about. And even though they know that no one cares about it, even though they know it fell on deaf ears, they just cannot relinquish it. It's like an addiction. To just give it up would be to admit, like, oh, actually, this was never really as important as we tried to pretend it was. This is another example of, and I think even as a very long time, harsh, devoted, not just critic of, but someone who really harbors a lot of contempt for the corporate media, even I sometimes think, oh, their lies and propaganda can't be that deliberate, can't be that systematic. Just look at how often they lie, how continuously and relentlessly they push false narratives that are only about their politicized agenda, and every time it gets exposed, every time it gets revealed, they continue to insist that they either got it right or they just move on as nothing happened. The same thing was true with claiming that anybody concerned about Joe Biden's cognitive decline was engaged in right-wing disinformation, only for that obviously to have been fully vindicated in every way. And yet over and over they were insisting angrily that anyone questioning Joe Biden's cognitive abilities was engaged in some sort of twisted propaganda. This is why faith and trust in the media has completely collapsed. You can just almost every night give a different example. But to try and equate January 6th as a coup and insurrection on par with 9/11 and Pearl Harbor or the Holocaust and slavery, to depict Donald Trump as a Nazi-like figure, only to then completely abandon it and not follow through on any of the steps you would absolutely embrace if you truly had that authentic conviction that that was true, is just going to erode all of this even further. None of their actions are commensurate with their stated beliefs, and that basically is another way of saying not just that somebody lied, but that they are very well aware that what they said was a lie.
So just to give like a final side note, you have to be very, very careful in situations like this. When you study Black history, especially in the late 40s, 50s, and 1960s and 70s, you look at what the FBI did under J. Edgar Hoover, which was COINTELPRO. It was a counterintelligence program that was used to subvert and dismantle and cause disarray within the Black struggle, Black resistance movements. Um, obviously, they were watching. Obviously, they sabotaged Marcus Garvey and the Atlanta Black Star. They obviously, sabotaged and spied on Martin Luther King. They obviously and assassinated King. They obviously, spied on and tried to subvert Malcolm X and killed Malcolm. Same thing with Fred Hampton and the Black Panther Party, also murdered by the FBI. And then you kind of fast forward after, September 2001. They go in, they pretty much create these uh, they create Muslim sympathizers inside of America. Um, Pretty much start arresting them, working with them to pretty much entrap them into a whole scheme. Same thing with Gretchen Whitmer. You fast forward to Jan6. Now, there's 200 FBI agents and informants on the premises. They're letting them in, they're waving them in, they're, shaking their hand and, ha ha he he with these rioters and these protesters. When you even go to, as somebody like myself, I've even been to several protests, Black protests in Charlotte. Um, of course, it starts off pretty peaceful. Of course, there's people who are there who are upset, you know, obviously demanding more from law enforcement and stuff like that. But then give it about a good hour or two, here comes usually white folks. They're white folks in ski masks. They're wearing bandanas. They're wearing all black. Right before my eyes, they start kicking and pushing officers off their bikes. They start taking knives and popping the tires and to the CMPD cars. And next thing you know is CMPD comes around the corner, goes back into the police station, comes out with riot gear, and then one thing leads to another. Next thing you know is the same people who just showed up in all black. They're throwing Molotov cocktails, they're breaking stuff, they're vandalizing stuff, and then just one thing just leads to another, literally just to cause um, a disarray within the movement. So you have to be very, very careful about these intelligence agencies, about the deep state, literally coming in, doing COINTELPRO, um, and you never know who's an informant. You never know who's there just to sabotage a movement and just to put, a bad light out there with their destructive ways and habits. So I didn't really want to get too much into that right now. That's something for a later date. But y'all be safe. Y'all be good. Peace.